Beneath the blasted lands, excavations are underway at the crypt of Alvariel. Those that liben maken camp upon mine coast. Thou shalt accompany Authoritix and removen their blikening from mine land. The Crimson Dawn camp? Moxus allowed them that land to facilitate trade and peace with their kingdom. We get resources rare to this region, and they profit in trinkets. Ach, Keru Nacht. Their presence is repugnant to me. Incorporex, taken those Nigromancer, and Sion is done. Thou willa, mine king. My lord! A host of the dead approach bearing arms!
I knew that necromancer couldn't be trusted. Curse him and all oathbreakers. Rally the men, we need to load the ships. I'll be damned if we leave that wretched bastard anything useful.
The Undead rock up with two objectives, their primary being to destroy the Crimson Dawn forces, driving them from the field. But Gideon also wants to capture as many supplies as he can. The humans want to prevent this and buy time for their boats to be loaded, so we are more or less using the Oathstone scenario from the rulebook. The human champion Aiden the Ironcoat and his block of spearmen deploy forward at the central supply wagon, with goblin slave slingers on their right in the woods. Initiative on the first turn goes to the Crimson Dawn. Eager to clash, the Orc mercenaries rush forward, bellowing their war chants, selling their strength for battle and bloodshed. Arta's spear thrower, mounted on a captured dwarven carriage, releases its dart, streaking across the field to strike the Crimson Dawn spearmen, puncturing their ranks and throwing 3 men from their feet. A shout from the Ironcoat keeps them steady. Crimson Dawn soldiers wheel and dash forward around the woods, moving quickly to support the spearmen. The Wickerwood Wardens march forward in unison, bones clattering. Archibald of the Council shuffles to the side, calling on the weave of magic to sharpen the skills of Aiden Ironcoat and his spearmen with the Blade Mastery spell. The Wormreach hunters shuffle forward into the woods, but their binding is weak and they are unable to do more. The Crimson Dawn militia are unnerved by the dead before them and shuffle forward reluctantly. They're camp workers, not soldiers. Gideon Hex tracks the Wickerwood Warden's advance and, watching through the ranks of the Bleak-Eyes Bone Crushers, binds a handful of the strands to cause the spear skeleton's weapons to ooze a noxious, tar-like liquid. The goblin slaves whip their slings around their heads and throw a scattering of rocks at the approaching wardens, resulting in one skeleton falling apart as a sling stone shatters its ribcage. Under urging from the slave master, they then retreat deeper into the cover of the woods. The strands of the weave parted and sparse around them. The Bleak-Eyes barrow guards slowly march forward, their animating magics weakened. The Crimson Dawn bowmen rush up, slowing to avoid further disorder in the ranks of the militia. They shout encouragement towards them. Grond Prix drives his chariot forward, rumbling and squeaking around the withered woods on the left flank. The Trade Prince and his bodyguard canter forward on their left, eager to crush some undead beneath their hooves. Incorporex pivots as the cavalry move, then soars forward, unhampered by the rocky ground he passes over. Unwilling to wait any longer, Aiden Ironcoat leads his spearmen forward, charging into the Wickerwood Wardens, who present a wall of spears towards their assailants. Reflexes enhanced by magic, Aiden batters spear tips aside and throws himself into the skeletal ranks, hewing about with his sword. The spearmen crash forward in his wake, bronze spear tips holding some back, while others use their broad shields and the length of their own spears to smash skeletons to pieces.
Drive them back!
5 are shattered in the initial assault, with one unlucky man falling to a spear thrust from the side that sinks into his armpit. 2 further skeletons are destroyed as the weight of the spearmen's assault drives them back, though the spearmen's ranks appear chaotic as they are dispersed by the depth of their charge. As the skeletons are forced back, Authoritix leads the Bleakrise Bone Crushers forward, pivoting to avoid exposing their flank to the dangerous Crimson Dawn spearmen. So ends turn 1, pretty standard, both sides moving up, the Undead having a little trouble with their activations, and the Crimson Dawn Spearman and Champion Aiden reaping a mighty toll on the Wickerwood Wardens, though they have overextended in the process.
Come on then, you unnatural beasts.
Initiative on turn 2 goes to the Undead with a 9. Authoritix wields the Bone Crushers, then charges them forward, striking the Crimson Dawn Spearman in the flank as Aiden shoves his way through the ranks to meet them.
End their lives.
Axes chopping and rending, the Revenants cut through the men, their lengthy spears and shields providing little defence to the unit's side, as 4 fall before the Undead.
Suffer not the living.
Aiden's sword sings its own song of death as he rips through 3 Revenants on his own, his already formidable skills enhanced by the magics of Archibald. Despite his efforts, the Undead charge drives the Spearman before it, and cutting down a further Revenant as he falls back to his men, the Crimson Dawn Spearmen regroup in the woods to their flank, in good order. Their appearance had been disordered, a ruse all along. Ha! See? Even you were fooled. Their proximity to the supply wagon gave them the extra boost they needed to pass that first morale test. Unfortunately, the ruse was more effective on the men behind them than the Undead before them, and the Crimson Dawn soldiers fail their activation, shifting forward uneasily as apparent disaster unfolds before them. Gronprix tugs on the reins as the spearmen emerge at the edge of the woods and careens along their flank, his mighty bronze mace poised to swing along the side of the chariot. Aiden rushes to meet him. In an effort to avoid being tangled in the woods, Gronprix keeps his distance and slays only 3 of the men with his sweeping strikes. Aiden lashes out with his sword, but the cautious Revenant maintains his distance as the chariot rumbles past, and Aiden merely snaps some of the wicker railing on the side of the fighting platform. Gronprix circles his chariot around to charge again, and the spearmen maintain good order as they settle into the woods. Pivoting around, Archibald of the Council moves forward to spot the Crimson Dawn horsemen, and with a chant and a sweep of his hands, enhances their martial skills with the Blade Mastery spell. Arta's spear thrower is swung about on its carriage and looses a bolt towards the Crimson Horseman. The shot slips harmlessly between the riders and clatters to the earth in the distance. The slave slingers mill about in the broken woods until the slave master threatens them with his goblin catcher.
Want some of this?
More afraid of that wicked tool than the haunting trees around them, they sling stones towards the back of the Bleakrise Bone Crushers, but their efforts are half-hearted at best, and downright rebellious at worst. The Wormreach hunters loose their dilapidated arrows towards the Crimson Spearmen in the woods before them. To everyone's surprise, an arrow strikes one of the men in the shin, puncturing bone and taking him from the fight. The rest of the men remain in good spirits, and the skeletons hold their ground, the woods providing them with a buffer. The militia continue to move forward, stopping in line with the Crimson soldiers. They seem to know what they're doing, so we'll copy them. Gideon Hex turns on the spot to spy the Bleakrise Bone Crushers, and chanting words of power, twists the weave to coat their axes with poisonous black slime. Wary of the cavalry moving up on the flank, he gathers his robes and picks his way forward to give himself a bit more distance between them. The Crimson Dawn bowmen run up alongside the militia and clamber up the side of the barrow mound. Reaching the top, they bend their bows and release a shower of arrows towards the chariot in front of them. The arrows rain down around Gronprix, sticking proudly from the chariot's frame and wheel, but causing no damage to the construction. The Wickerwood Wardens march in unison back towards the fray, wheeling to protect their flank. The Orc mercenaries trudge forward, some crashing through the woods to keep an eye on their goblin chargers.
I'm watching you, scum.
Incorporix howls as he surges forward, floating freely over the rocky ground to come to a halt, hovering in the open, barrow-bladed axe clutched in ghostly hands. Their mounts shine at the unearthly howl. The trade prince and his men struggle to keep themselves in the saddle. After much coaxing, they calm their horses and move into position, preparing to charge. The necromantic binding on the Bleakrise Barrow Guard continues to be weak, causing the spear skeletons to stutter in their march. Given a moment, it re-strengthens to a tolerable level, and they are puppeted back a few steps, their job to guard the ballista rather than be crushed beneath a cavalry charge, their brittle spears a little deterrent. Turn 2 ends with the human force moving up in a respectable line. Their overextended spearmen have been hammered from all sides, but continue to hold their ground, weakening all who come for them. The undead need them crushed in order to advance their left flank.
Ready yourselves, men! We charge on my signal!
Initiative on turn 3 goes to the undead, just with a 5 and 3. Authoritix seizes his chance, ordering the Wickerwood Wardens to cover his flank. He wields the Bleakrise Bone Crushers and charges the soldiers of the Crimson Dawn.
Suffer not the living.
Rolling again because of a camera failure, user error, the Bone Crushers slam into the soldiers, heavy axes tearing shields aside, buckling coats of plate and rending open flesh. 4 soldiers fall to their assault as they hunker behind their shields.
Hold them back.
Terrified by the attack, the soldiers huddle back, barely killing one Revenant in return, because I allowed them to use their original role out of pity, before retreating and reforming in a disordered mess. As they flee, a further soldier falls as a minor scratch turns nasty when the Revenant's poison blades take effect.
It's not natural.
The Wickerwood Wardens wheel and charge forward, clipping the flank of the Crimson Spearmen as Aiden moves to meet them. Thrusting forward with their spears, they bite deep into the humans' ranks, 3 falling on bronze tips, with a further succumbing to their ensorcelled blades. Aiden does what he can, felling 3 skeletons in his first strike, and 2 more as their uncaring nature leaves them wide open. But his men begin to quail and look for an escape as the remaining skeletons back away to charge again. Not to be outdone, Trade Prince Grayson orders the Orc mercenaries to cover his rear as he wheels his horsemen and spurs towards the lone figure in the open. His mount bounds forward in a gallop. He readies his spear, leaning forward and thrusting with all his might. Incorporix unleashes a hateful scream, rising into the air, arms outstretched and axe held as if weightless. The mounts of the other horsemen rear and buck, squealing in fear at the wraith's piercing shriek, leaving the Trade Prince to face the horror alone. His horse shying at the last moment, Grayson's thrust remains true, catching the figure in the abdomen below the breastplate of bronze. But the Trade Prince should have paid more attention to the stories of his nanny, his lance passing through the insubstantial robes to no effect. He ducks low, clinging desperately to his mount's mane as it shifts beneath him, the sudden movement saving his life, as Incorporix unleashes a whirlwind strike with his axe, soaring forward into the midst of the other cavalry. The horses scatter at his approach, keeping their riders out of the wraith's reach, and the 2 sides separate, with calls of
Rally to me! We charge again!
and fire! We need fire! being accompanied by the wraith's haunting screech. Blocked by the milling cavalry, the Orc mercenaries curse their ineffective allies and shift sideways, trying to make their way around the heaving mass and stamping hooves. On the other side of the field, the Wormreach hunters knock and release into the spearmen once more, their arrows passing through the trees and catching one of the spearmen just under the jaw, causing him to sink to the ground, choking on his own blood. Aiden keeps the remaining men together, though they would sooner be almost anywhere else. Spotting their chance to make a difference, the militia come to the aid of the pressed soldiers, wheeling about and charging the Bleakrise Bonebreakers in the rear.
Get into it, lads.
While less disciplined than the soldiers, they've proved themselves to be no less effective with axe and sword, chopping down 3 of the Revenants from behind, though 1 falls to a Revenant's axe in return. Buoyed by their success, the men remain in good spirits, cutting down a further uncaring warrior as the rest are driven before them. The skeletal crew of Arta's spear thrower finish resetting their weapon and lay a heavy dart into its groove. Raising the heavy mechanism, the crew track the cavalry's movement, lining up on the shouting Trade Prince, spear circling high in the air as he rallies his horsemen to charge again. Tugging on the release cord, the catch is unlocked and the drawstring snaps forward. Grayson's rallying cries are cut short as the front of his coat of plates is punctured, steel buckling and ribs splintering. He's thrown bodily from the saddle to bounce and roll heavily across the ground as the bronze tip of the protruding dart rips his insides apart. Momentarily shocked by the gruesome scene, the horsemen steel their resolve amidst current threats, and the mercenary orcs and goblins appear uncaring or perhaps unknowing to the trade prince's fate. While immune to the traditional weapons of the enemy, a strange quirk of Incorporix's curse renders him unable to pass through the bones of the earth, effectively keeping him imprisoned within his barrow whilst the entrance is sealed. This strange quirk is unknowingly exploited by the goblin slaves as they pelt Incorporix with stones from their slings, the projectiles striking his insubstantial form and wounding the wraith's essence, mainly succeeding in making him angrier. With the Revenant line breakers on their flank, the slaves wheel back to keep the slave master safe behind them. Gideon Hex turns about, briefly enraptured by the terrifying howling of the maddened wraith. He rapidly twists strands of the weed, and the tips of the Bleakrise Barrow Guard spears are coated in a toxic ichor. With few other targets in range or sight, the Crimson Dawn bowmen continue to rain a steady stream of arrows down on the chariot-riding champion, Gronprix. Though his heavy cloak and armour and the surprisingly sturdy construction of the chariot itself weather the shower with no ill effect. The binding on the Bleakrise Barrow Guard continues to falter, and rather than charging forward as Gideon had hoped, the spear skeletons advance a little before grinding to a halt, their animating magics causing them to twist in unnatural ways. Shocked by the death of Trade Prince Grayson, a flabbergasted Archibald of the Council stares open-mouthed for a moment too long. While in the grand scheme of things an inconsequential member of the Merchant Guild, his death will still need to be explained to the rest of the Council, and Archibald is not looking forward to that conversation. Growling at the pestering hail, Gronprix looks for appropriate targets. The remaining spearmen are taking shelter in the woods, which his chariot will struggle to navigate. The archers on the barrow mound are also untouchable, so long as they stay up there. Again, his chariot unable to climb the stone wall of the mound. So turning with a tug of the reins, he rolls onwards towards the back of the Crimson Militia, at last a target in the open. And that ends turn 3. What an upset! From the death of the Trade Prince, to the Goblin slaves and militia achieving more than the Wraith and Cavalry combined. A lucky shot from the ballista has crippled the Crimson Dawn's most expensive unit, and they will never ride Gideon down if they can't get through Incorporix first. What in the hells is that thing? Initiative on turn 4 is taken by the Crimson Dawn with a 10. Tough choice to start with. Do they hit Incorporix with the cavalry activating on 1 dice? Try rallying Aiden the Ironcoat. A lone champion is a force to be reckoned with. Or charge Authoritix and his line breakers in the back before he can use a command activation, pinning him in place and giving the soldiers a chance to rally. Doubling down on their earlier success, the Crimson Militia hit the back of the Bleakrise Bonebreakers once more, chopping down 2 of the undead creatures, though one of the militia is caught by a heavy strike in return. The defence of the resource wagons, keeping the men focused, they finish off another of the uncaring revenants as they continue to push their line before them. Hoping to capitalise on the wavering spearmen, the Wormreach hunters loose another volley through the trees. But the spearmen's thinning numbers and the skeleton archers' general lack of both eyes and the muscles required to draw a bow makes their arrows less than effective. Keeping their cool despite the loss of their leader, the Crimson Dawn horsemen hurriedly rummage through their saddlebags, working together to strike flint and steel and spray a pitch-soaked torch with sparks. As the volatile brand ignites, the horsemen cheer and the bearer spurs his mount, charging at the horrifying wraith, flames flaring as the torch sweeps through the air beside him. With a slightly terrified cry, the horseman angles his mount past Incorporix and standing in his stirrups, he leans out and delivers a solid strike down on the Wraith's head. The brand bursts in a cloud of cinders as it hits Undeporix's bronze helm, flaming pitch spraying out, and the Wraith shrieks in pain, the warmth of fire anathema to the cold of the grave. Enraged and seeking to escape the heat, Undeporix shoots forward among the other horsemen and, whipping his axe around him, douses the lives of 2 of the shocked men before they can act. They scatter, reforming at a distance from the ghostly figure, preparing further tortures for their next encounter.
Get it lit, get it lit.
In an effort to keep the human champion busy, the remaining Wickerwood Wardens march back in towards the Spearmen of the Crimson Dawn, with a tiring Aiden moving to meet them. He deflects the spear skeleton's strikes with quick beats from his sword, closing the distance to carve his blade through the remaining skeletons and scatter them both among the desiccated roots of the woods. He turns and gives the remaining spearmen an encouraging smile, but their expressions remain grave or distracted. Still haunted by the assault of the Bonebreakers, the Crimson soldiers struggle to calm themselves and mill about in a loose group instead of reforming. The sorceries animating the Bleakcry's barrow guards strengthen at last, and spears raised ready to strike, the skeletons march into the flank of the Crimson Horsemen. Distracted by their frantic fire starting, the horsemen are slow to react, and 2 fall to the reaching spear points, with a further cavalryman collapsing from the saddle as the weapon's toxic coating turns a shallow wound deadly. Hemmed in by ranks of spear tips, the men fail to find any opening to strike back, and their courage faltering at last, they are forced to retreat from the wall of points. As the cavalry fall back, they push through the ranks of the Orc mercenaries, momentarily throwing them into chaos. The officer is able to quickly restore order, however, and reforms ranks to protect the horsemen's retreat and give them time to recover their nerve.
Pathetic.
The crew of Arta's spear thrower rapidly crank the drawstring back and reset their machine, taking aim at the Crimson Horseman. A tug of the release cord sees another dart propelled forward, this time in a low arc to strike a horse in the flank, causing the animal to stumble and throw its rider from the saddle. As the horseman lands heavily with a crack, his sword arm breaking at the wrist, his mount sinks to the ground, whinnying piteously. Cradling his fractured wrist, the horseman swiftly eases his mount's passing and retreats from the field, unable to continue the fight, as his comrades continue to assess their options. Bending their bows, the Crimson Archers loose another volley at the Revenant champion, Gronprix, their arrows skipping off the chariot's frame and protruding from the horse's remains, but ultimately proving little more than a nuisance to the champion. They continue to hold to the safety of the barrow mound, remaining close enough to contest the cart loaded with supplies. Gideon Hex sees no reason to change a winning strategy, and shifting his attention to the champion Gronprix, enchants his bronze club with a slick coating of black ooze. Stones whirling around their heads, the goblin slave slingers pelt the Bleakcry's Bonebreakers and shot, the solid projectiles pulverising the desiccated skin and bones of the revenants, causing one to topple as its remains are powdered. While the rain of arrows on the champion Gronprix have remained largely ineffective, the sheer volume of shafts sticking from the chariot's frame begin to bind the wheel, tangling in the spokes and locking the chariot in place. Gronprix is forced to spend a moment clearing the thicket of spines from the chariot's flank in order to get moving again, delaying his assault on the militia's rear. Archibald turns to face the soldiers, brandishing his staff and bellowing words of power to twist the weave. A blade mastery enhancement may help steel the soldiers' resolve, but fickle as always, the magical strands resist and the spell fails to take effect. At the end of turn 4, the human cavalry have taken a beating, the undead able to overcome their high defence from all sides. Many of the human units are disordered, but the undead are starting to look thin on the ground. They only have 3 units left that are capable of capturing the wagons, so they had better start getting them into position.
Chariot? More like chariot, hey? Oh, he's right behind me, isn't he?
Initiative on turn 5 will go to the undead with a double 9. With the Corpse King active once again, we're using the Oathbreaker's table within his domain, and his insidious whispers and dark promises tempt those with a taste for power. Succumbing to his dark seductions, one of the Crimson Spearmen drops his spear and shield. Aidan the Ironcoat, giving him a disappointed look, convinced the man means to flee. But in a sudden rush, he rips his dagger from its sheath and lunges at the unsuspecting champion. Unprepared for the betrayal of one of his own, Aidan fails to react, and the spearman's dagger is rammed beneath his chin, above the protection of his iron mail. Aidan's sword drops from nerveless fingers and he sinks to the ground, a confused expression locked onto his face. The remaining Crimson Spearman stands staring open-mouthed, shocked at what just transpired, as the turncoat assassin flees into the wastes. Madness. With a rasping shout behind him, Authoritix urges Grondprix to engage while he takes care of the faltering Crimson soldiers in front of him. Grondprix obliges, snapping the chariot's reins and urging the horses forward. The uncaring beasts crash into the rear of the militia, bowling the lightly armed men over and trampling them beneath skeletal hooves. Grondprix lays about with his bronzed club, reaping a terrible toll. 7 of the camp workers fall to the charge, with the final militiaman succumbing to the dark poison as a minor abrasion festers and his veins blacken. Grondprix cheers his might among the carnage.
Death to the living.
Authoritix leads his final bodyguard onwards, determined to scatter the wavering soldiers before him. The approaching danger focuses the men, and, outnumbering the revenants, they bully them with their shields, keeping their axes from finding flesh. Working together, the men decapitate the final bodyguard, and uncaring of his own life, the captain Authoritix leaves himself wide open with no guards remaining on his flanks, and one of the soldiers drops him with a mighty axe blow to the helm.
Got the bastard.
The Crimson Horsemen gather themselves, steeling their resolve, and pivot to face the Wraith in the gap. If they can get through there, they can ride down the Necromancer puppeting this army. Consumed with cold anger, Incorporix tears towards the Orc mercenaries, a hateful screech preceding his onslaught. His axe sweeps out, cutting through the flank of the Orc formation, dropping 3 of the mercenaries. The remaining Orcs cry out in terror, scrambling for a dropped torch, guttering on the ground. One seizes the smouldering brand, swinging it wide as the Wraith looms behind him, and the embers feed on the rushing air, bursting alight just as the torch strikes, spraying Incorporix in molten pitch. Screeching in anger, Incorporix is forced back by the flames, but the Orcs are scattered, and horrified by the ghostly creature, they're on the edge of rout. Surprisingly disciplined, the goblin slaves whirl their slings around in the woods, unleashing a barrage towards the chariot-borne champion in front of them. The stones clatter off the frame, one striking Grondprix in the breastplate, denting the bronze. Grondprix stumbles back, briefly unbalanced, but grabbing hold of the wicker railing, he secures himself and weathers the bombardment unharmed. Still shocked by the betrayal that played out right in front of him, the final spearman is caught unawares by the latest scattering of arrows let loose by the Wormwood hunters, and drops when struck by one of their twisted shafts. With the way now clear, the skeletal archers advance through the woods. With no other targets in sight, the Crimson Archers continue to rain arrows down on Grondprix, but he remains unscathed by their attention. Gideon Hex turns and, tugging on a portion of the Mystic Weave, enchants the weapons of the Bleakrise Barrow Guard to make the merest scratch deadly.
Toxicus armor!
Calming himself, Archibald turns around and, with a series of precise gestures and intonations, binds a handful of strands and enhances the martial skill of the Crimson soldiers. With their arms enhanced, the Barrow Guard advance on the Orc mercenaries, marching forward with spears protruding, ready to strike. Defending themselves as best they can, the Orcs' broken ranks are overcome by the massive spearheads, 3 falling as the skeletons advance, with a further going down to their poisoned blades. Pressed by the thorny hedge of points, one of the Orcs manages to penetrate the first line of spears, smashing a skeleton to the ground with his heavy mace before he's forced back by the subsequent ranks. Attacked from all sides, their brothers falling around them, and the enemy shedding no blood to satisfy their lust, The remaining Orc mercenaries know when it's time to go, and contract be damned, flee from the field. The Crimson Horsemen watch them go, unsurprised at their flight and just happy the mercenaries brought them time to regroup. Shifting their attention to the wavering ranks of the Crimson soldiers, Arta's spear thrower releases a dart to sail past the sparse woods and splinter on the ground beyond their target. There are a lot of units starting to disappear from the field at the end of turn 5, the Undead still maintaining 3 units able to capture, and yet they still have none in position to secure the available resources. Gideon has to get a hurry on if he wants to achieve his second objective. Initiative on turn 6 goes to the Crimson Dawn with a 9. The Crimson Horsemen prove their mettle, itching at the chance to destroy the Undead, not this futile attempt to establish peaceful relations with them. Getting another torch lit, they spur towards the Wraith, the torchbearer leaning forward in the saddle, lit brand held ahead like a spear, and teeth gritted as flames blow back along the shaft. But with an ear-piercing shriek, their charge falters, the torchbearer's mount coming to a sudden stop, and the horseman tumbling forward out of the saddle. As he rolls with the impact, somewhat dazed, the torch slips from his fingers, and Incorporix is suddenly among them. Consumed by his hatred of the living, his axe a blur in his grasp, Incorporix reaps a whirlwind of destruction among the last few horsemen. Uncaring of whether his strikes bite man or horseflesh, he leaves them a bloody ruin across the wasteland, his hateful howls punctuating his madness. Grondprix snaps his chariot's reins, surging at the Crimson soldiers who brace behind their shields, presenting the Revenant champion with a solid wall of wood and rawhide. Nevertheless, as Grondprix runs his fighting platform along their front line, the heavy strikes of his bronze club smash shields aside, breaking bone and knocking 2 men from their feet. One of the soldiers lands a solid blow to the chariot's wheel, but the bronze rim withstands his strike, and leaning recklessly over the side, Grondprix snaps the offending limb, the other soldiers unable to capitalise on the Revenant's wild attack. As Grondprix circles around to go again, the soldiers fall back, dragging their wounded comrades with them. They continue to maintain their discipline and shakily reform their lines. As the soldiers fall back, the slave slingers continue to pelt the Revenant champion with stones. But despite their best efforts, they're unable to land a damaging blow, the chariot's frame and Revenant's heavy breastplate and helm resisting their strikes. The Bleak-Rise Barrow Guard, their path now clear and their binding seemingly stabilised, advance on the closest resource wagon. Beginning to lose hope of victory, the Crimson Archers shower Grondprix in another wave of arrows. The chariot must be taken out, but again their arrows fail to strike a vital point. Arta's spear thrower releases another dart, this time towards the goblin slaves sheltering in the woods. The dart strikes one of the trees, bursting it in a cloud of rotten splinters, but leaving the rag-clad goblins unharmed. Feeling the battle slipping away, Archibald panics a little, searching for a solution while his eyes are inexorably drawn to the chariot bearing down in his direction. He calls out to the remaining men,
"That's long enough, men! Burn the wagons!"
Getting tangled in the woods, the Worm-Reach hunters manage to wheel their formation, lining up the central wagon, which they can capture in a rush. Gideon Hex continues to manipulate the weave like a master, the Corpse King's gift enhancing his powers, and the blood soaking the axe in Incorporix's ethereal hands turns from red to a glistening black. That ends turn 6. Unless the Crimson Dawn manage an upset, the Undead will claim victory on the field, but the men of the Crimson Dawn can still tarnish that victory by preventing the capture of the resources the Undead are after.
You slaves stay here. I'll get help.
Initiative on turn 7 is taken by the Undead with an 8. The Bleak-Rise Barrow Guard wheel and march in formation into the woods, slamming into the back of the goblin slaves, their slave master bravely running off to the side.
Let me get out of your way.
The skeleton spear thrusts forward in an almost mechanical cadence, plunging into the unprotected bodies of the slingers and killing half the unit in one
I
engagement.
don't know what we do.
Unwilling and unable to fight through the thicket of spears, the goblins are flooded with relief when the skeletons back off, and surprisingly enough, they bravely stand their ground, maintaining good order, their fear of the slave master greater than that of the undead.
Good slaves.
Turning towards his closest wagon, Archibald dashes forward towards it, mind desperately trying to recall the components required to produce flame from the weave. Arta's spear thrower takes aim at the slave slingers again, but the woods prove adequate cover and the dart is deflected in its flight by the desiccated branches. The Crimson Bowmen spot the Wormreach hunters emerging from the woods and realising they're making a beeline for the central supplies, loose a volley in their direction. Unfortunately, their arrows have no effect on the skeletal targets and they shuffle sideways towards their closest wagon, preparing to douse it in oil and set it alight. Incorporix spins in a swirl of ethereal robes, passing through the dead husks of trees as he ghosts towards the goblin slaves. Axe snapping out, he fells one slinger after another, carving down their line. The final slave makes a desperate, if futile attempt to stop the wraith before it falls to the poison swirling around Incorporix's sweeping axe. With all of his charges gone,
thank
the
you.
slave master makes a swift exit.
My job is done.
The Crimson soldiers manage to steel themselves, rallying and pivoting to face the woods to burn the supply wagon if Archibald cannot. While the volley of arrows from the Crimson Bowmen failed to cause any damage among the Wormreach hunters, the battering rain of shafts proves to be just enough to interrupt their march. Acting on their most basic animating logic while Gideon's mind is occupied elsewhere, they take a moment to redress their ranks before marching forward, slowing them just enough that the wagon remains out of reach. Grondprix desperately wishes to run the last of the human soldiers down, but with Gideon noting both the hunters' failure and the Crimson Bowmen dousing their distant wagon with oil, he follows the necromancer's instructions and, pulling his chariot around, moves into position to capture the central resources. With the fight all but over, Gideon looks around desperately, trying to find a way to avoid the destruction of the remaining resource caches. But the men have sold their lives dearly, and his forces have been held back and depleted enough that his options have all dried up. With a resigned sigh, he accepts that the majority of the supply wagons will be lost.
Incendi? No. Igniti? No. Ah, of course, Flamma!
Initiative on turn 8 goes to the Undead, and Grondprix successfully secures the central wagon. With no other units being able to activate next to uncontested wagons, Archibald and the Crimson Bowmen are able to set their wagons alight before conceding the field to the Undead and making for their boats,
Giving the Undead the victory, albeit a minor one.
Why dost thou linger? I had hoped to secure the supplies and prove myself of value to the king. Thou value leggen thou traust, which given Achion of late is under question. Proven ist, following instruction, none more goal. I didn't ask for this, unlife. Dann Ende ist, and joining those mindless mass, or in brechen ist.